The Saturn family of American rockets was developed by a team of former German rocket engineers and scientists, led by Wernher von Braun, to launch heavy payloads to Earth orbit and beyond. The Saturn family used liquid hydrogen as fuel in the upper stages. Originally proposed as a military satellite launcher, they were adopted as the launch vehicles for the Apollo moon program. 3 versions were built and flown: the medium-lift Saturn I, the heavy-lift Saturn IB, and the super heavy-lift Saturn V. The Saturn name was proposed by von Braun in October 1958 as a logical successor to the Jupiter series, as well as the Roman god's powerful position. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy identified the Saturn ISA-5 launch as being the point where U.S. lift capability would surpass the Soviets, after having been behind since Sputnik. He last mentioned this in a speech given at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio on the day before he was assassinated.
Mr. Secretary, Governor, Vice President, Senator, members of the Congress, members of the military, ladies and gentlemen. More than 3 years, I've spoken about the new frontier. This is not a partisan term, and it's not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an area which calls for action, and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers. I have come to Texas today to salute an outstanding group of pioneers, the men who manned the Brooks Air Force Base School of Aerospace Medicine and the Aerospace Medical Center. It is fitting that San Antonio should be the site of this center and this school as we gather to dedicate this complex of buildings. For this city has long been the home of the pioneers in the air. It was here that Sidney Brooks, whose memory we honor today, was born and raised. It was here that Charles Lindbergh and Claire Chennault and a host of others who in World War I and World War II in Korea, and even today, have helped demonstrate American mastery of the skies, trained at Kelly Field and Randolph Field, which form a major part of aviation history. And in the new frontier of outer space, while headlines may be made by others in other places, history is being made every day by the men and women of the Aerospace Medical Center, without whom there could be no history. Many Americans make the mistake of assuming that space research has no value here on Earth. Nothing could be further from the truth. Just as the wartime development of radar gave us the transistor and all that it made possible, so research in space medicine holds the promise of substantial benefit to those of us who are earthbound. For our effort in space is not, as some have suggested, a competitor for the natural resources that we need to develop the Earth. It is a working partner and a co-producer of these resources. And nothing makes this clearer than the fact that medicine in space is going to make our lives healthier and happier here on Earth. I'll give you 3 examples. First, medical space research may open up new understanding of man's relation to his environment. Examination of the astronaut's physical and mental and emotional reactions can teach us more about the differences between normal and abnormal, about the causes and effects of disorientations in metabolism, which could result in extending the lifespan. When you study effects in our astronauts of exhaust gases, which can contaminate their environment, and seek ways to alter these gases so to reduce their toxicity, you're working a problem similar to those we face in our great urban centers, which themselves are being corrupted by gases and which must be cleared. And second, medical space research may revolutionize the technology and the technique of modern medicine. Whatever new devices are created, for example, to monitor our astronauts, measure their heart activity, their breathing, their brain waves, their eye motion, great distances, and under difficult conditions, will also represent a major advance in general medical instrumentation. Heart patients may even be able to wear a light monitor, which will sound a warning if their activity exceeds certain limits. An instrument recently developed to record automatically the impact of acceleration upon an astronaut's eye will also be of help to small children who are suffering miserably from eye defects but are unable to describe their impairment. And also by the use of instruments similar to those used in Project Mercury, this nation's private as well as public nursing services are being improved, enabling one nurse now to give more critically ill patients greater attention than they ever could in the past. The third, medical space research may lead to new safeguards against hazards common to many environments. Specifically, our astronauts will need fundamentally new devices to protect them from the ill effects of radiation, which can have a profound influence upon medicine and man's relations to our present environment. Here at this center, we have the laboratory, talent, the resources to give new impetus to vital research in the life sciences. I'm not suggesting that the entire space program is justified alone by what is done in medicine. The space program stands on its own as a contribution to national strength. And last Saturday at Cape Canaveral, I saw our new Saturn C1 rocket booster which with its payload when it rises in December of this year, will be for the first time the largest booster in the world, carrying into space the largest payload that any country in the world has ever sent into space. That's what I consider. I think the United States should be a leader. A country as rich and powerful as this, which bears so many burdens and responsibilities, which has so many opportunities, should be second to none. And in December, while I do not regard our mastery of space as anywhere near complete, while I recognize that there are still areas where we are behind, at least in one area, the size of the booster, this year I hope the United States will be ahead. And I'm for it. We have a long way to go. Many weeks and months and years of long, tedious work lies ahead. There will be setbacks and frustrations and disappointment. There will be, as there always are, pressures on this country to do less in this area as in so many others, and temptations to do something else that's perhaps easier. But this research here must go on. This space effort must go on. The conquest of space must and will go ahead. That much we know. That much we can say with confidence and conviction. Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer, tells in one of his books how as a boy, he and his friends would make their way across the countryside. And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high, too doubtful to try, and too difficult to lift their voice to continue, they took off their hats and tossed them over the wall. And then they had no choice but to follow. This nation has tossed its caps over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it. Whatever the difficulties, they will be overcome. Whatever the hazards, they must be guarded against. With the vital help of this aerospace medical center, with the help of all those who labor in the space endeavor, with the help and support of all Americans, we will climb this wall with safety and with speed, and we shall then explore the wonders on the other side. Thank you.
To date, the Saturn V is the only launch vehicle to transport human beings beyond low Earth orbit. A total of 24 humans were flown to the moon in the 4 years spanning December 1968 through December 1972. No Saturn rocket failed catastrophically in flight. Early development. In the early 1950s, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army actively developed long-range missiles with the help of German rocket engineers who were involved in developing the successful V-2 during the Second World War. These missiles included the Navy's Viking and the Army's Corporal, Jupiter, and Redstone. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force developed its Atlas and Titan missiles, relying more on American engineers. Infighting among the various branches was constant, with the United States Department of Defense (DoD) deciding which projects to fund for development. On November 26, 1956, Defense Secretary Charles E. Wilson issued a memorandum stripping the Army of offensive missiles with a range of 200 miles, 320 kilometers or greater, and turning their Jupiter missiles over to the Air Force. From that point on, the Air Force would be the primary missile developer, especially for dual-use missiles that could also be used as space launch vehicles. In late 1956, the Department of Defense released a requirement for a heavy-lift vehicle to orbit a new class of communications and other satellites. The spy satellite program was top secret. The requirements, drawn up by the then unofficial Advanced Research Projects Agency (ARPA), called for a vehicle capable of putting 9,000 to 18,000 kilograms into orbit, or accelerating 2,700 to 5,400 kilograms to escape velocity. Since the Wilson Memorandum covered only weapons, not space vehicles, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency (ABMA) saw this as a way to continue the development of their own large rocket projects. In April 1957, von Braun directed Heinz Hermann Kohl, chief of the Future Projects Design Branch, to study dedicated launch vehicle designs that could be built as quickly as possible. Kohl evaluated a variety of designs for missile-derived launchers that could place a maximum of about 1,400 kilograms in orbit, but might be expanded to as much as 4,500 kilograms with new high-energy upper stages. In any event, these upper stages would not be available until 1961 or 1962 at the earliest, and the launchers would still not meet the DoD requirements for heavy loads. In order to fill the projected need for loads of 10,000 kilograms or greater, the ABMA team calculated that a booster first stage, with a thrust of about 1,500,000 lbf, 6,700 knots, thrust would be needed, far greater than any existing or planned missile. For this role, they proposed using a number of existing missiles clustered together to produce a single larger booster. Using existing designs, they looked at combining tankage from one Jupiter as a central core, with 8 Redstone diameter tanks attached to it. This relatively cheap configuration allowed existing fabrication and design facilities to be used to produce this quick and dirty design. Two approaches to building the Super Jupiter were considered. The first used multiple engines to reach the 1,500,000 lbf, 6,700 knots mark. The second used a single much larger engine. Both approaches had their own advantages and disadvantages. Building a smaller engine for clustered use would be a relatively low-risk path from existing systems, but required duplication of systems and made the possibility of a stage failure much higher. Adding engines generally reduces reliability, as per Lesser's law. A single larger engine would be more reliable, and would offer higher performance because it eliminated duplication of dead weight, like propellant plumbing and hydraulics for steering the engines. On the downside, an engine of this size had never been built before and development would be expensive and risky. The Air Force had recently expressed an interest in such an engine, which would develop into the famed F-1. But at the time they were aiming for 1 million lbf for 1,400 knots, and the engines would not be ready until the mid-1960s. The engine cluster appeared to be the only way to meet the requirements on time and budget. Super Jupiter was the first stage booster only. To place payloads in orbit, additional upper stages would be needed. ABMA proposed using either the Titan or Atlas as a second stage, optionally with the new Centaur upper stage. The Centaur had been proposed by General Dynamics, Astronautics Corporation, as an upper stage for the Atlas, also their design, in order to quickly produce a launcher capable of placing loads up to 8,500 pounds, 3,900 kilograms, into low Earth orbit. The Centaur was based on the same balloon tank concept as the Atlas, and built on the same jigs at the same 120-inch, 3,000 millimeters diameter. As the Titan was deliberately built at the same size as well, this meant the Centaur could be used with either missile. Given that the Atlas was the higher priority of the two ICBM projects and its production was fully accounted for, ABMA focused on backup design Titan, although they proposed extending it in length in order to carry additional fuel. In December 1957, ABMA delivered Proposal, a National Integrated Missile and Space Vehicle Development Program to the DoD, detailing their clustered approach. They proposed a booster consisting of a Jupiter missile airframe surrounded by 8 redstones acting as tankage, a thrust plate at the bottom, and 4 Rocketdyne E-1 engines, each having 380,000 lbf, 1,700 knots of thrust. The ABMA team also left the design open to future expansion with a single 1,500,000 lbf, 6,700 knots engine, which would require relatively minor changes to the design. The upper stage was the lengthened Titan with the Centaur on top. The result was a very tall and skinny rocket, quite different from the Saturn that eventually emerged. Specific uses were forecast for each of the military services, including navigation satellites for the Navy, reconnaissance, communications, and meteorological satellites for the Army and Air Force, support for Air Force crewed missions, and surface-to-surface logistics supply for the Army at distances up to 6,400 kilometers. Development and testing of the lower stage stack were projected to be completed by 1963, about the same time that the Centaurs would become available for testing in combination. The total development cost of $850 million during the years 1958 to 1963 covered 30 research and development flights. While the Super Jupiter program was being drawn up, preparations were underway for the first satellite launch as the U.S. contribution to the International Geophysical Year in 1957. For complex political reasons, the program had been given to the U.S. Navy under Project Vanguard.